Welcome to the last security seminar of the semester, and I believe it is also the final security seminar of the 32nd year of this series of seminars, which I realize is probably running longer than some in the audience have been alive, but we have the honor of having Dr. Paul Vixie with us today to speak to us. You can read his bio online, but the major points. He's a VP and distinguished engineer at Amazon. He's been involved in internet security for decades. We've known each other for quite a while, and he is most notable for some of the work that he has done in name resolution, distributed services. DNS is often associated with you as one of the primary protocols of interest. With an incredible wealth of experience, he's been involved in many issues. And without taking more of his time, let me turn this over to Paul Vixie. And Paul, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Gene. So thank you for joining. I know this is a compressed part of the annual academic calendar, so it can't be easy to take time out for this. As the internet has become the world's sort of digital nervous system, and now that it is responsible for, probably safe to say, the majority of economic activity, or if not responsible, at least enabling of, it turns out that some of the design parameters, some of the original architectural principles did not last and have been subject to revision. Some of that revision has been quite chaotic. Some seems planned, but it's having some impact on how we live and who has access to what and how and why. And I'm particularly interested in the domain name system because it, in turn, is the enabler of most internet activity. In other words, every click of a mouse, every command in a command line shell probably involves one or more DNS lookups. And that in turn means that if someone who is hostile to you or hostile to your personal autonomy or your national sovereignty is able to get access to the stream of DNS lookups, then even if they don't make any changes, in other words, they don't cause you to receive failures or perhaps wrong answers, or perhaps add insertion answers, they can still determine a lot about who you are, what your preferences are, what you might do next, based on simply DNS signals. And this should not be news to you. I'm not trying to bring fire from the mountaintop on that topic. What I want to tell you is what's been done about it and by who, and what impact that might have on this generation and generations to come. The vital thing is that we understand what's going on, because from that we can determine whether we ought to be trying to change it. So the rule of law really comes about through nations, right? Nations are the entities who make laws. The definition of a nation is maybe a little bit obscure, but it turns out it has three components, and this was determined in order to settle the 30 Years' War in Europe a couple hundred years ago, because a lot of people wanted to sit at the negotiating table, and some mechanism had to be found to have only the relevant parties there, and so that was the original definition of being a nation. So first, you must have borders, which the government of the nation can defend. You don't get to declare that there are borders and then have no means to make sure that people observe those borders. Within those borders, the government has to have a monopoly on power. In other words, if there are sort of warring kingdoms within a region and no one regime has the ability to sort of guarantee what is happening within those borders, and especially what crosses them, yeah, you can't be a nation. You got to only claim to represent that which you actually do control. And finally, if something crosses that border toward the outside, the government has to be responsible for it. To the extent that the government might like to be able to say, yeah, that's just angry people who hate the neighboring kingdom, and so they cross the border with their spears and swords, and the government takes no notice of that. You know, we can't stop them. Well, if you can't stop them, you're not the government. So this is very simple, and it is pretty much what the United Nations uses today to determine what is a nation that would have a seat in various assemblies. The problem with the internet is that it is borderless. And so the fact that nations are all sort of determined based on borders and the ability to control things about those borders and having monopolies on power and so forth means that there are kind of not really nations as far as the internet is concerned. And in the absence of nations, it does not matter what laws are made by nations. What you have is the rule of the strongest. Whatever you can get away with tends to be what passes for effective law in the internet. That is maybe the beginnings of what I'm trying to tell you today that isn't obvious. But the internet came along and changed everything, and no one at the time that the change began really understood, you know, we're going to have to really find a new way for humanity to work with itself, because we're entering a time when value and also force can take the form of information which respects no border. So in the context of military operations, we started with land, and that was how force projection worked. You know, people with swords or tanks or whatever it was. And you could have kind of a hierarchy of which nations were able to dictate terms to which other nations based on who was the strongest land power. And that worked right up until sea power, at which point the strongest sea power was going to be the one having priority as far as imposing their will, because sea power tends to beat land power. Inevitably, air power came along and upended the table again. Space is of special interest to us because you know, we talk about space weapons, but what we have is space surveillance. In other words, the ability to know exactly what's happening without having to overfly, without having to infiltrate, to know exactly where some competing nations' assets are located, or to devise a plan for neutralizing them or whatever, can be done from space, and it can't really be blocked. And so space power was the first purely informational domain of operation, and it beat air power and sea power and land power. If you know exactly what's happening and no one else does, you can probably figure out a way to you know, frustrate their aims and impose your will. And one of the things nations do is to impose their will. That's not part of the definition, but it is certainly one of the results. You don't get to continue to have a monopoly on power if you're not able to impose your will. So you can think of that as the substrate. So finally, there is information itself, not necessarily related to space, but information of any kind, however gathered, however stored, however processed. If you are a nation and you have sort of the strongest information assets you know the most, you can compute the most, you can store the most, cross-correlate the best, then you will be able to impose your will. And it might not be the traditional manner of rolling tanks across a border and, taking the government prisoner and all the rest of that, but you will still be able to dictate terms and cause nations who have less information power than you do to behave the way that you want them to. And I'll come up with some examples for that later on. So, for the technical among us, I think it is fair to describe DNS and its role in the information flows and infrastructure of the internet. Everything that is connected to the internet in any way, including my phone on this Wi-Fi, has an IP address. Now that IP address may not be a universally unique IP address. We kind of ran out of IP addresses some time ago, and so we all use similar addresses locally, and then they get translated to dissimilar unique addresses as we leave our homes, leave our ISP, leave our campus. But somehow, in order to use the internet, you must appear to have a unique IP address, because that's how the routing system is going to work. That's how the system will determine whether the packets you're sending are allowed to come from where you are. And if what you're sending demands a response, this is how the routing system will decide how to get those responses back to you. BGP, Border Gateway Protocol, is how we advertise the reachability of those addresses. It would do you no good to use a unique address if it was completely random and unaffiliated with your connectivity. So there have been a number of routing protocols throughout the decades, but BGP is the one that we use today and have been using for the last, I'm going to say 2.5 decades. It is continuously enhanced, but it's been more or less the same protocol throughout. So all this does is to take a group of IP addresses that is assigned to your location in the topology and offers reachability of that group of addresses to whatever neighboring networks that you're connected to. And if you don't have BGP, then it won't matter what you send, because it will not it won't leave and the answers won't come back. Importantly, IP addresses are hard to remember, right? If you want to send email to somebody at cerias.purdue.edu, there is probably an IP address that would get you there, and you might be able to send to an address with an @ sign and then some IP addresses. But those addresses will change frequently, and so your responsibility in that case would be to keep track of what they are right now, and that's too much work, so we don't do it that way. We could. Again, I want to state the system originally worked that way. Today, we use the domain name system in order to remember symbolic names that are, semantically meaningful to us, so that we can simply send to some address at cerias.purdue.edu, for example, and whatever IP address that currently is will essentially be filled in. And that's huge. And that is also how the web works. If you could put IP addresses into your browser, and we often have to at home when we're talking to our ISP gateway, but you shouldn't. It's hard to remember them. So every time we click on a link in a web browser, every time we send email, every time we do something that requires knowledge of what is connected to the internet and what address does it have right now, for example, relies on DNS. So this is a 3-layer dependency, and it has served us pretty well. In other words, the internet was 9 orders of magnitude smaller when it was pre-commercial, just an academic thing, and we're still using the same basic stuff. I can't think of any other technology in human history that has scaled as well. It's not that it doesn't change, it's just that it doesn't fundamentally change. All right, so again, for the technical among us, I want to remind you how the DNS works. And I know that sounds like a daunting proposal, but it isn't. DNS is very simple. The protocol will fit on the back of a cocktail napkin, or drawings of the packets. And there are really only 3 types of protocol speakers in the entire system. This laptop or my smartphone or your smartphone are stub resolver shown center bottom. That is where the questions enter the system. That is how DNS learns that somebody wants to know something. Stub resolver does not obviously have complete information. It does not keep track of anything you might potentially look for. In fact, it starts out tabula rasa. All it knows is the address of a recursive server. And it gets that either because you select it or learns it when it joins the Wi-Fi or whatever. So there's very little information required for the stub to sort of boot up and start being useful, because all it's going to do is send its questions to a designated place. And that is the recursive server shown center. That is the most complicated and most security interesting part of the whole system. Complexity tends to go hand in hand with security implications. So among other things, this has a cache, so that if it has answered some question recently for anybody that it would normally receive questions from, if it gets that question again, it can answer using the copy it already has. And it is that cache that has allowed DNS to scale 9 orders of magnitude without a fundamental redesign. But of course, there's always new information. Somebody might ask a question that has not been asked recently enough. It isn't in cache, and so the recursive server has to go find that information. So again, the recursive server does not have complete knowledge about where things are stored in the DNS. It starts out with a very small amount of bootstrap information, which is the list of the root name servers. There are effectively 13 of those. There would be more, but we can't fit more into the packet, and so every one of them is actually a cathedral of sorts. If you send to a given root name server, you could be talking to any of 100 different copies of that root name server around the world. So there are a lot more than 13, but there are only 13 addresses. But if you know that, then you can find anything you might potentially want to know. If, again, let's use CERIAS.purdue.edu as an example. If you wanted to know who's responsible for receiving email for CERIAS, but you don't know anything, then you'll go ask the root name servers, and they know very little, but they know where .edu is. And once you know where .edu is, you can repeat the query there. And .edu does not know everything. It certainly doesn't know what CERIAS is, but it knows what Purdue.edu is, and it'll tell you where. You go to those servers, you ask for CERIAS.purdue.edu, and it knows the answer, because that's part of that local authority zone. So it's all opportunistic. We cache as much as is safe to cache, and we always have some method of reaching the information that we need. So that's it. Okay, that was 3 minutes. Now everyone within the sound of my voice knows as much about the DNS as I do, because that's all there is to it. Answers come in at the top, questions come in at the bottom, and they meet in the center. Now I've drawn something here that sort of fits into our narrative about force projection, and that is the idea of an IP firewall. And what you're seeing here is an IP firewall that is preventing anybody except the recursive server from sending questions to those authority servers. In other words, if you want to do DNS, you have to do it the way I just said. This is not universal. It used to be. I mean, there was a time when there wasn't such a thing as an IP firewall, but in the era since there have been IP firewalls, there have been times when it was universal that you did not let any of your stub resolvers talk to any DNS server except yours. And that's because it leaks a lot of information, and we don't like to leak personally identifiable information. That turns out not to be what every single player in this game wants. And so there's been some back pressure around that IP firewall idea. But I just want to say this is the traditional way that we did it. And in that time, we had these long, skinny chains of sort of a string of pearls that would get you from where you are out through your local area network, which today would be Wi-Fi, and then through some campus infrastructure, which could be your house, out to an ISP, Internet Service Provider, who had only the job of connecting you to the rest of the Internet. And again, it was simple, it was minimalistic, it gave us good fences, and good fences do make good neighbors. And it got us through the critical first couple of decades when we didn't know what the Internet was going to be other than step by step. Okay, so I mentioned at the outset that knowledge of what DNS lookups a given smartphone is making leaks a gigantic amount of information about the user of that smartphone. And information about users is a source of power in the world, either because you want to show them an advertisement that is tuned to their interests, or you want to keep a list of what they have done in case you might later want to sell that information to brokers of various kinds for either economic or political reasons. Or, if you are perhaps an authoritarian government and you're worried about rebellion, you might gather all that information in order to guess who the rebels will be. All of these things have been seen in action. And what this indicates is that power has changed everything. The Internet wasn't all that important in the first couple of decades, and then it became so. And it became so without any preparation. All of a sudden it was important, and we hadn't done any of the work we should have done to harden it against various forms of what most of us would call abuse. The DNS resolution path, which I've shown you, has been a particularly attractive target. Right around the year 2000, a company called VeriSign, who was and remains the steward of the .com zone, so if you have a name that ends in .com, you indirectly got it from them, decided that they really wanted to monetize their access to questions about .com, and so they put a wild card in. And just for the technical among us, a wild card means there are no wrong questions. There is no question you can ask that will receive a negative answer. And I can tell you, having observed the system, that there are a gigantic number of wrong questions. My colleague, Evie Nemeth, observed and published a paper maybe 25 years ago indicating that 98% of the queries that were reaching the root name servers were receiving negative answers. And obviously, that was not because humans were typing them. That's a whole bunch of automation that's got a lot of stuff hard-coded that doesn't exist. Nobody knows why. But anyway, if you stop giving negative answers, then one advantage that Verizon and their partner SiteFinder got was the ability to see all of your mistakes, and maybe if it was an obvious letter transposition or some other typographical error, they could correct it for you. But what was more likely is you were looking for something that didn't exist, and that was a keyword, and they could do keyword searching through an advertising database and give you a positive answer that would point you toward some search page that you could then presumably find what you really want and click on it. This was controversial because of the personally identifiable information. There's obviously no regulation that prohibits this. Had there been any law that prohibited it, it wouldn't have mattered because laws have borders and the Internet doesn't. So this was kind of the opening salvo in this whole information war. And there were a lot of lawsuits and a lot of meetings and white papers and so forth. And eventually they took that out. But it certainly showed the rest of the world what was possible and focused some light on that, illuminated some opportunities. So at some point, OpenDNS, who was operating a global name service, and their claim to fame was, they would say, look, don't trust your ISP. You should send your DNS request to us, because they might be data mining you, they might be doing ad insertion. There's all kinds of terrible things that your ISP might be doing. You shouldn't trust them. You should trust only us. And so that message was effective, and they had a lot of customers that used them. Obviously, there were no IP firewalls in the way of that. And that's because most of the time, if all you have is a connection to some cable internet provider, they're not going to put a firewall between you and the rest of the world. If you don't want to use their DNS servers, they won't stop you. So anyway, OpenDNS saw the success of the Google search page, and they kind of did a similar thing to what VeriSign had done with the wildcard. They arranged that if you asked a question that should have received a negative answer, what you would get is a search page. And, oh, by the way, they changed their recursive server implementation. So if you ask a question, www.google.com, you wouldn't get Google. You would get the OpenDNS search engine. And, this must have struck right at the heart of Google's reason for existing. And, OpenDNS didn't have a search engine, so they couldn't answer your questions. All they did was had a form. You'd enter your search terms. It would remember what those were, and then redirect you to the Google search page, because they've got no search engine. So when Google complained and they said, you should not be intercepting the requests that users are making about www.google.com, what OpenDNS said was, look, you're still getting all the traffic. It's just that we're also getting it. So we don't see the problem. We don't plan to stop. Within about 2 months, starting from a standing start, Google developed Google DNS and put 8.8.8.8 into the world. Because if you can't get them to stop, then you have to beat them with your scale. And I'm not sure Google would ever have gone into the DNS business if not for the activities of OpenDNS. And that shows that for every action there is a potential reaction. Shows that every time you raise your game, you invite others to do the same to restore the status quo that they preferred. If what you wanted was a situation that everybody could live with and compromises had been made, then you're going to have to negotiate. This is an odd form of negotiation. It takes a lot longer, and it does not necessarily reach the optimal result. But if you think about 8.8.8.8 and all the other services that were offering DNS that weren't in the ISPs, this created a terrible problem for a different class of provider, and that was the content delivery networks. Akamai was the one that we knew at that time. Cloudflare would be an example of it today. CloudFront, part of AWS, is another example. There are a lot of them. And the problem is that these content delivery services were accustomed to hearing a DNS request from some ISP name server and saying, all right, I see the address, and that address helps me predict where a web fetch would come from. And so I should give them a tailored answer to the DNS request so that when somebody, actually follows through and tries to fetch something, they're going to fetch a copy from something close to them, giving them excellent performance. Now, there are a lot of reasons why this is hard. And one of the fragilities that was discovered at about this time is that if it's OpenDNS, then the IP address of the DNS request no longer has any similarity to the topology of the subsequent web request. So you could no longer optimize that. And So they all got together and they did negotiate, and they said, look, we need to kind of make that work. We need to get the content delivery networks to not be upset by all of these different non-ISP DNS providers. And they came up with a terrible idea. It's called eDNS Client Subnet. I am sometimes blamed for it because I am the creator of the eDNS protocol extension that made it possible. And the idea is that if you're a name server, let's say you're a Google name server or an OpenDNS name server or some other non-ISP name server, and you want to tell Cloudflare and Akamai and all the other CDNs where the web fetch will come from so that they can optimize their answer, you simply attach part of the address of the stub resolver to that upstream request. And this is a huge amount of complexity there, which I'd love to tell you more about, but I don't think we're going to have time today, although there are hallways out there. But of course, one of the awful things is nobody does it right. You're supposed to send just the network portion of the stub resolver's address, because what you don't want to do is turn it into something that is personally identifiable information. In other words, the question you're asking and the identity who asked it. So you want to kind of mask off the lower order bits. That's quite uncommon. As the operator of a root name server, I can tell you that normally we get 32 bits for an IPv4 eDNS client subnet. And I suspect that the reason is that the people who implement those things are not all that concerned about privacy, and so anything they can get to work without adding extra logic to do things that they don't care about is good. I mean, it's not good, but it's good for them. All right, very famously in 2013, Edward Snowden flew to Hong Kong and gave over to the press a whole bunch of secret government materials about the US, I guess, NSA, and just detailed all kinds of sort of government uses of information force. And it caused a lot of eyebrow raising, a lot of concern. A lot of people were outraged. They had no idea that the US government was doing some of the things. And that was naive, right? You should assume that any government, in order to keep the nation from being absorbed by some other nation, is doing whatever they think they have to do. And, I know people in our national security apparatus, and they are patriots. They're not using this as some, terrible big brother oppression thing, but I guess that's the fear. So one of the things that was shown is that agents of the US government were breaking into wiring closets full of fiber optic panels, and they were inserting passive optical splitters, and then they were siphoning off a copy of other people's traffic. And that in turn set the hair on fire for the whole generation of incoming technologists. That was a bridge too far. They weren't going to tolerate it. And so the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, decided at that time that there should be nothing in clear text, nothing that any breaker in of a wiring closet, and nothing could be seen from a passive optical splitter. It should all look like random binary gibberish because it will all be encrypted, strongly encrypted. And that is still the policy. That is what the IETF said in roughly 2014 with RFC 7258 was the biggest problem we had, and that is what most people who are working inside the IETF, as I have done various times, that's what they believe, that's what they're doing. Let me tell you what that's going to mean. So first, just to give an update, the topology shifted. It was no longer a string of pearls because your recursive DNS server might be in one part of the internet, your content delivery network might be in another, and that is why we have eDNS client subnet. So we've been adding a lot of features to DNS partly to encrypt it and also to authenticate it. Because if you are in the middle, if you're able to act as a middleman and there is no cryptographic signature on the data, then you can cause someone to receive a wrong answer and they won't be able to know whether it's a wrong answer. So authenticity is, I think, a virtue in a world full of ad insertion, but also secrecy is kind of a virtue in a world full of passive optical splitters. It's important to remember that while the content of DNS is public, anybody can ask for it, the question stream is kind of not public. That has personally identifiable information in it. Anyway, ISPs and OpenDNS have kind of abused their position. They were in the DNS resolution path and they wanted to monetize that position, and so they did things. And inevitably, when you do things, people who liked things the old way are going to find a way to get back their previous operating conditions. First, we wanted to do secure DNS, and that's just authentication. So every zone of authority has a key. The public part of that key is put into the DNS, and the private part is used to generate content. And so it's the normal key pair public-private thing where you use one to either encrypt or sign, and the other to either decrypt or validate. So nothing was invented there. It just took a while to apply those concepts to DNS. We've been working on this particular problem since 1996. It's still not ubiquitous. That's what I mean by hard. But while that does fix the tampering problem, it does create other problems, makes the system more fragile. Right? It doesn't give you more resiliency, it gives you less. There are more situations where you can get a failure if you have more complexity. And famously, NASA was doing something in space and they had a live video feed, and you could watch what was happening. And it was very popular. Everybody was interested in this, especially the customers of Comcast. Because Comcast was the first ISP to turn on DNSSEC validation, such that if the answer did not match its signature, then it would not be given back to the stub. And it turns out NASA had a key management oops, and so they were not using the right DNS signatures for the data. So no one who was a Comcast customer got to see that particular event in space. There is no complexity that does not create some kind of new resiliency problem under certain conditions. It's better if we red team future operating conditions before we finalize our decisions about what will be developed. Anyway, since this only handled authenticity but did not handle secrecy, somebody said, yeah, we need to have TLS, which is pretty much the same crypto standard that we use for HTTPS, so that people with passive optical splitters, or maybe they're running an intermediate host of some kind, firewall, deep packet inspection, will not be able to see what question a human has asked. I consider this a reasonable precaution. And we had something within a year or two of wanting it that kind of works, but it's deploying very slowly. Part of it was that TLS assumes that you know the domain name of the generator of the signature, and you don't in this case. All you know is the IP address. And so it took some time to figure out exactly how we were going to put the pieces together, but we did. But here's the problem. It used a different TCP port number. Normal TCP DNS uses port 53, and we knew that we can't just add TLS there. There's, the negotiation could, make impossible normal non-crypto operations. And so we used port, I think, 853. And so problem solved as far as I was concerned. But there were people who were very concerned not so much about surveillance, the ability to observe this, or the ability to perturb it, as they were the ability to keep it from happening. In other words, that IP firewall I showed you earlier was really in the way of a lot of business plans. They did not want policy-based DNS. They didn't want protective DNS. They wanted to see everything. And the problem with TLS is it has a fixed port number. So you can, in your firewall, simply say TCP 853 can only come from the approved name servers inside this campus. Again, perfect solution from my point of view, unacceptable to others. Therefore, 2 years after DNS over TLS was complete, work began on DNS over HTTPS. HTTPS is the secure version of the web protocol. It's on TCP 443. And the idea here is to have pretty much the same crypto strength, because it is, after all, just TLS, but to use the same port number that the web uses. One person who was instrumental in bringing this about said, "I dare anybody to block port 443." And indeed, very few people are willing to block port 443. So that's why we have two encrypted DNS standards, DOT and DOH. And DOH is deploying more quickly because it just does what a web browser would do, and so there was not a lot of work that had to be done to make it possible. I've raised my hand at some point and I said, yeah, but there might be valid reasons why we have policies forbidding certain DNS lookups. And in particular, CISA, the .gov team that is a shadow of its former size, had in those years recommended something called protective DNS for all Americans. And that in turn requires that you be able to say, I see that you asked a question. I know that the domain name that you're asking that question of is harmful. It is only being used to, do a phishing attack or do a crypto mining attack or ransomware attack. And so since you've asked a question where I know from the question itself that it's in danger, protective DNS would have you say, I'm not providing that answer. I'm going to block it in DNS. That's not the only way to defend a user population. Indeed, there will never be a single way to do so. But this is one tool in the bag. It was also used extensively is still used extensively for parental controls. I've spoken to sort of modern thinkers, modern parents in Europe who have said, yeah, I don't do parental controls. I want my children to grow up, knowing that the world is full of danger, and, I trust them to have good judgment. And I don't know what to say to those people because I've been in law enforcement circles and I've learned about grooming, and I've learned that our children are at extreme risk unless steps are taken. And parental filtering at the ISP level is one of the things that we can do. So that's a disagreement in philosophy that is representing itself as a difference in technology. DOH is meant to disintermediate any controls. And I want to get back to telling you what that all means. In 2010, my nonprofit Internet Systems Consortium, they are the BIND people, created something called Response Policy Zones. It's a name only its programmer could love. But it was a way to do protective DNS at scale with a pub-sub model so that you could have providers of policy that weren't running DNS servers, and then you had subscribers to those policies, so you could get some specialization of labor. That's in all modern name servers today, but it started out as an idea that we had. In 2014, the IETF published something in response to the Snowden attacks called RFC 7258, Pervasive Monitoring is an Attack. And I suppose that's true from a certain point of view. In 2016, we got DNS over TLS working. A couple of years later, 2018, we got DNS over HTTPS working. At some point, I guess also 2018, we did TLS 1.3. Now, you think about TLS and the good work it does, keeping our information secret and or authentic. And it seems like if there's a new version of it, it's probably a net good. But it turns out that the IETF has got a real mad on about what Mr. Snowden disclosed. And so there's a particular feature in TLS 1.3 called ECH, Encrypted Client Hello. And a lot of people didn't realize that even though the content of a HTTPS session, all the payloads were encrypted, the control packets were not. In particular, the hello packet that identified the host name that you wanted to talk to. This turned out to be vital for something called the next-gen firewall, because a lot of either college campuses, government agencies, commercial entities, they wanted to be able to see what the host name was before deciding whether to permit that particular HTTP transaction to take place. And you need to know the host name, because if it's part of a server farm, part of a content delivery network, it could have a single IP address that is able to answer for tens of millions of different domains. So you can't have policy that's based on that IP address, because you'd have almost pure false positives. So you need to see the name. And turns out being able to see the name was part of the the Snowden blowback. And so in TLS 1.3, you could negotiate to encrypt that client hello, which will make corporate firewalls that relied on this completely ineffective. And I think the impact is going to be different from what the ECH team was hoping for. Talk about that at the end. In 2020, the RFC 8890 came out. The internet is for end users. Now, if you read that at the time, I raise your hand and tell me, did you do what I did? I checked my skull. I felt everywhere on my skull looking for a Cat5 jack to see if somehow I was connected to the internet, and I wasn't. So this does not mean that the internet is for end users. The internet is for whoever makes this. I would sometimes like to be in the room when the IETF is coming up with stuff like this. All right, so in 2021, RFC 9000 was proposed, also part of the Snowden blowback initiative. And in this, we are apparently going to replace TCP/IP with QUIC. It's quick, and it's based on UDP, as DNS itself has been based on UDP. And this is entirely designed to prevent any intermediary from being able to understand any part of the application flow. You might want to have a rule, for example, that says a TCP SYN packet is allowed to leave my network but not enter it unless it's going to the following addresses. This is pretty common, and it's what makes it possible for us to surf the web without ourselves being surfable from outside of wherever it is that we're operating. That's not going to be possible here. You can't tell. There is no SYN bit. There's nothing about a quick packet that tells you whether it's a connection initiation or not. And in case you're tempted to think, oh, well, you can just look at what direction it's going. No, you can't, because it could easily be a continuation of a long dormant flow. This is deliberate. Furthermore, if you have endpoint protection software, so-called antivirus or anti-malware, because most of these phones and laptops are pretty weak, and you need generally to have some supervision about what it's allowed to do. So if what you want to do is see the TCP connection as it's going out to maybe be able to tell, yeah, you've asked me to block things like that. I'm blocking this because it's like that. Yeah, that's not possible in a quick world. If you're used to sitting in an IDE, single-stepping some malware that you have captured in order to ultimately find out what it is connecting to as its command and control server, and then what commands is it sending, what crypto is it negotiating, that's what you want to do. You can't. This has the highest entropy that we know how to make, and it's got negotiation built in so that when we figure out how to make it even harder to understand it, that will roll out more or less incrementally. I don't love this. In 2022, I mentioned that CISA launched its protective DNS effort, which is completely irrelevant in a DOH world. So, since I showed you the earlier picture, I'll show you the current picture. You've still got that IP firewall, but it doesn't matter because applications doing DNS are going to be using web protocols, and they're just going to bypass all of your local recursive servers, all of your protective DNS. Anything you might want to do to use DNS as a signal that something bad is happening is now denied to you. And you know, when I've argued with people who are in favor of this, what they've said is, you know, if you don't want people doing this, tell them not to do it. Yeah, you know, I have a Nest thermostat on my wall, and we learned 5 years after we got it that it had a microphone, and Google assured us that it had never been used. Yeah, we don't get choices about which protocols are going to get spoken unless we can block them in a firewall. This is not a trust but verify situation. This is a verify then trust situation. And our ability to verify is a threat to the business models of a lot of companies, and perhaps not a few nations. So if you think of the nations of the world that we call authoritarian, we can say certain things about them. You know, one is a whispered conversation is not necessarily protected because you know, anything that could be a threat to the authoritarian sovereignty has to be caught early. I'm not going to name names here because different countries step into this in different small ways. But one thing that they have in common is their belief that there is a border in cyberspace that is similar to the border in land and sea and air space. And they act that way. I know of a country who has more than 1 million of its own citizens who are employed by the government to watch what the other citizens are trying to do. That seems wasteful, and seems like there ought to be a better solution, but you can't tell them no. They have national sovereignty. They will do what they want, and they will potentially spend a great deal of money and electric power to restore the status quo. So anyone who has been working in the IETF world to say, this will fix it, this will make it so authoritarianism is not possible, we'll just fix it in the protocol, has not studied history. You cannot defend these borders, doesn't mean you can't try. That government will not have a monopoly on power. There will always be something happening that they can't see or can't stop, which means that they have to be on high alert at all times. And the things that emanate from such countries across those invisible borders, you can't point to the government and say, how come you didn't stop this? I'm going to hold you responsible for it. So this is completely non-national in the definition of nations, which I gave earlier. But when you're under coercion, you know, it's very difficult to take a deep breath and decide what's the right long-term answer. How can I negotiate a compromise here? You're under coercion, you usually want to get back what you just lost and maybe a little more, redress the balance. So here's Russia's response to all of this. The date on this was 2020. All of this has since come to pass. I don't know why people outside of Russia want to dictate terms to the Russian government as to how they're going to run their internet, but we did, and they didn't like it. What did we think was going to happen? All right, getting down to brass tacks here, I mentioned that there is a close relationship between complexity and risk. And, complexity does not have a single universal definition nor a unit. So if you wanted to say that one thing was more complicated than another, you'd have to say, how do you know? What are you counting? So I'm going to throw out just a working definition for the purpose of this talk only. Treat your distributed system as a collection of state variables, which includes locations in RAM and any connected device, and state transition functions. This is generally speaking an if statement in a program somewhere. And count them. Just say, how many of these do I have? All right, I'm about to make a change. I'm investing in something. I'm going to get some new functionality or better performance. There's some reason I want to make that investment, and I'm going to make it. All right, your investment is shown here as Q, because your investment is going to include some addition to the number of state variables and the number of state transition functions. And once you have added Q to the denominator, then your understanding level of your own totality has dropped. I have sometimes observed that you will get a better risk reduction from finding some old Solaris servers in a closet somewhere that haven't been upgraded or patched in recorded history, and just turning them off. And yeah, it's going to break some things. Wait, you'll get complaints. You'll fix it. You'll go figure that out. But you'll still be in a less riskful situation than you were before you found them, before you turned them off. Buying more hardware, buying more software, adding more features has a cost. And, a sensible strategy, either for business or engineering, is generally that you look at the total cost of operation, which will include what risks I might have, because all of a sudden there's a whole new source of potential 0 days. Firewalls are computers. They have software. Fairly often, if you add one, you will also create ways that people can attack you that they couldn't before you added that firewall. And if it doesn't happen on day 1, it might happen on year 3 when an update comes out that you're probably not going to red team in a debugger before you allow it on your network. We have to look at the total cost of operation. And as I look at what's happening with encrypting things that didn't used to be, and then working around the fact that things are encrypted that didn't used to be, there's Q. There's nothing but Q. We are drastically increasing the complexity of our system. And that will have maybe the greatest single source of cost as we enter this era. So I once had a talk with an ISP CTO in the early days of IP version 6. And I said, IP version 6 is coming. I was on the ARIN Board of Trustees at the time. That's an address allocator for this region. And you're going to need to be able to speak it. You've got to start upgrading your network so your peers and your customers and so forth can use IPv6, because we're out of IPv4 addresses. And he said, I hear you. It's a real problem. But I am in my 4th year of a stock vesting schedule, and the one that will follow that one will be less lucrative for me, so I will not be here after this time next year. So the problems that you're describing are real problems that my successor is going to have, but I see no reason why I should complicate my final year here in a bunch of stuff that will not come to fruition until long after I am passed. could not argue against his point of view except to say, that's kind of not professional of you, mister. But that's the way this often goes. We're generational in how we look at total cost of operation. And I kind of think we shouldn't be. I think we're here now, and we should be improving the operating conditions of those who come after us. And I'm very glad that nobody stopped President Kennedy from the speech about going to the moon, saying, you won't be here, I won't be here, why are we doing this? You know, it's because we is more than just the people in the room. So in the information age, information superiority is that trumps every other kind of superiority you might have, because what we're doing consistently everywhere in every app, in everything we do, you know, nobody asks you, you know, do you want me to turn this on, yes or no? It's always yes or not now, right? We are in a world where engagement with every single participant in the economy is what determines whether we are successful. So we are all surveilling everything we can, using it to predict what we can, and then using those predictions to control things. You know, supermarkets will often put milk at the back of the store so that you have to walk by everything else to get what you came for. Yeah, that was pretty polite compared to what we do now. So we have to deal with the fact that information superiority is what every government and every corporation wants. We have to want it too, as individuals, as innovators, as researchers. The difference is we got to want it for everybody, not just for speaking of ourselves personally. So, summing up, classical rule of law matters less than it ever did. It might evolve. We might change the definition of nation to accommodate the internet. Not sure how that could happen. We also know that every bypass and every restraint is just a challenge for our opponent to match our investment and restore the status quo that they preferred. And, you know, we could negotiate, we could cooperate, we could say, this is what you want, this is what I want. How do we maximize that for each other? But I don't know how to find the negotiating partner that I could sit down with. So at the moment, negotiation is off the table. And that's really it. I'm hoping for a few questions.
Thank you, Paul. We started a little late, and we've run a little bit late as a result, but we can take one or two questions in the room if people have them. Please remember to turn on your microphone in front of you if you're going to ask one. And I don't see any online at the moment, so is there anybody here who's got a question or otherwise?
I have a possibly silly question.
Okay.
It's possibly a bad question, but I was just, and maybe my neural network along this is bad. But when you were talking about the various phases of DNS and sort of how we've gone through securing DNS, to an extent, it kind of reminded me of how CAPTCHA and reCAPTCHA has transformed over time, and how with reCAPTCHA we've integrated continuous authentication to bypass a lot of that. Is there any research, or is there any similar-ish application, or would that kind of like continuous authentication instead to verify that like where things are going should go there not work because there's so much automation on the internet?
So not directly in the sense of end users benefiting from something like that, but we do have something called DNS cookies that are reminiscent of web cookies, so that if a server wants to, if an initiator, somebody who's asking questions, wants to make sure that the answers they're getting are coming from the same party across time, you can do that. But otherwise, there's no real applicability here. The right place to try to interrupt or surveil or modify DNS transactions is between the stub resolver, like this laptop, and the recursive server. And so that's where all the fight is come use my recursive server, because I don't like the idea that those people that you're using now could possibly observe your traffic, because then they could outcompete me in the ad business, right? So that's where the game is played, is at the bottom of the system. And the only place we have continuity ensured through cookies is at the top of the system.
Turn on your mic.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. It was fascinating. Actually, I come from political science department, so I cannot say that I understood all the technical terms that you've gone through, but then the basics of that you mentioned about the problem and then challenges that all those like technology development and interruptions and everything actually align a lot with the questions that I have. So maybe my questions could be a little bit conceptual, but then I wanted to ask you for your opinions on it. So I really enjoyed it for the fact that like you started out with the concept of the rule of law, because there's a paper that I just sent it out like with the title of AI and rule of law, rule and role of the law. So like basically what I wanted to talk about was what you talked about already. But another point that I wanted to talk about was that like the phrase that you said, big tech employees can innovate bigger regrets than ever, right? And considering that we're in the era of information with invisible borders, governments are not and cannot be responsible for those kind of like problems. So there's a concept that I think of and I developed with my coworkers back in my department called corporate quasi-sovereignty. So basically what we're trying to argue there is like big tech companies are trying to have like a quasi-sovereignty that the nation state used to have, because it seems like public consent and legitimacy sort of like very important concepts that used to be the foundation of our society don't seem to be matter anymore. So if this is the case, somebody has to do something about this, right? You showed me in the last slides that you find difficulties of cooperation and stuff. I totally understand. But what could be the incentives or any kind of like regulatory actions, or like who can do what to actually persuade not only the public to understand the challenges, because I don't think the public understand what it really matters to have their consent with the data or the use of like right DNS whatsoever, but also the big tech companies' roles and responsibilities in the society, because they seem to have the bigger power than sovereignty that the governments used to have.
Let me suggest that you can give a short answer to this and then have a discussion after we conclude.
Due to the pressing of time, I'll focus on just one part of what you said. When DOH, DNS over HTTPS, first came to the Mozilla Firefox web browser, they understood that there might be some controversy from deploying it. And so they integrated into it some geo-IP mapping. In other words, it would look at your IP address to figure out where you were in the world, so that they could try to avoid turning this on in places that it might be illegal or otherwise objectionable. And so for the first couple of years, they didn't turn it on for North America. And their first foray was Great Britain. And indeed, executives from the nonprofit company called Mozilla, headquartered in Mountain View, California, flew to London and talked with actual elected officials and explained what was going to happen, listened to objections, and then ignored all of them and then did it anyway. There's a great book also made into a movie called Rollerball. It talks about where we get to if nations fail and what corporations are what's left. Turned out to be prescient in this way.
Okay, if you can give a short answer to the one question in the Q&A, or I can read it to you if you'd like.
I got nothing. You're going to have to read it.
It says, very inspiring talk, thank you. Wenhai Sun from CIT. Question is, with the increasing adoption of DOH and DOT, how do you see the balance between user privacy and the ability of organizations to monitor and secure their networks? And then accounts that has run into similar problems elsewhere. So do you have comments on how that balance is going to play out, or is that just an evolving battle?
Well, I love that this question presumes that we own our networks, because that is not the attitude of our IoT makers and of some of our smartphone makers and our application makers. They really think that we're terrible ISP, and they will is that end-to-end packet connectivity is not growing as fast as it used to. We are running things through proxies, application layer gateways, so that your session to try to reach the internet is actually reaching your edge, and you're using a key that it understands so that it can see the traffic you intend to send and receive. And if that does not violate policy, it will regenerate that activity going toward the outside. We all hope that that doesn't have more vulnerabilities. We all hope that that doesn't give us a new surveillance opportunity that will then be uptaken by whomever. But we know, and at least I know in my heart of hearts, that it will increase Q, and with that will come increased risk. And there's no way to avoid that now.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Paul, for coming to speak here. And he'll be available here for a little bit after the talk. And if any of you online had a question that wasn't answered, if you want to mail it to me, and I will forward it on to Paul to see if he has a response later. So thank you all. Have a good end of semester. Our seminar series starts again in August when the school year resumes. So good luck with your finals, for those of you who are taking them and those of you who are grading them. Thank you again, Paul.